The year was 1780, and Ichria was in a stable, albeit uneasy balance. Abraham Le Wittenberg stood between the factions as the unifying figure for them all. His word was obeyed, not out of fear or fanaticism, but out of respect. His gentle hand steered the nation through trying times, and seemingly out to clearer waters. But underneath these calm oceans, nefarious forces were beginning to bubble up. Aviv Nazari always warned the Alcad that anything to alter the religious order was playing with fire. Le Wittenberg understood this, but still believed that the revolutionary principles couldn't simply be discarded. He enacted these reforms fairly and gradually, using the revolutionary principles to unite the nation while not going too far as to antagonize the average citizen. Still, Nazari warned that no matter how tactfully you play with fire, there's always a chance of getting burned. His fears seemed unfounded to most. That is, until one day, when shots rang out that changed the history of Ichria and the world forever. Outside the steps of the capital, the founding father of the nation was gunned down by Islamic radicals seeking to restore the old order. And with that, the illusion of Ichrian stability was shattered. Aviv Nazari was in Kuwait overseeing some construction project when he heard the news. His heart sank, and he knew what potentially lay ahead. Regardless, he didn't have any time to grieve, so he immediately rushed back to Baghdad as soon as he possibly could. There was an initial outpouring of public sympathy, a brief period of peace, but Nazari knew that soon after this, every faction vying for control would be out with a vengeance. He capitalized on the initial hysteria by publicly donating funds for the funeral from his own pockets, by publicly announcing his intention to launch a full investigation both in general and within the armed forces to ensure there were no more traitors about. He arrived at the Ground Council, who were receptive to anything which would avenge Le Wittenberg. He convened a special military commission later that week to fully investigate the potential of a plot within the army. Nazari knew that the chances of such a plot were very slim, but he thought it would be a good opportunity to show his loyalty to the dead Alcad as well as to remove any potential political threats within the army's ranks. It should have been fairly simple, but there was another general of equal standing to Nazari. Heinz Ezekiel stood across the table from Aviv Nazari and recognized what he was doing as a stupid plot to inject his politics into the military. When Nazari requested that he launch a full investigation into his portion of the army, Ezekiel responded simply, quote, "My army is professional and beyond politics. An investigation is not only pointless but counterproductive by asserting political oversight over what is meant to be an independent force." Aviv Nazari responded with a quick comment insinuating that Ezekiel might have something to do with the plot, though he of course knew this wasn't true. The Grand Council, in their paranoia, hastily ordered a full investigation regardless of any concerns. Heinz Ezekiel stood quietly the rest of the meeting, simply staring at Nazari with a look that he would viscerally remember again, nearly 30 years later. With that out of the way, Nazari believed it was time to transition back to a state of normalcy, but the council disagreed. The council, which is overrepresented by members of the former National Revival Society, and with Le Wittenberg gone as a moderating force, they ordered more investigations and put forward various reforms meant to totally upend the religious order. Nazari increasingly realized that if the Grand Council went unchecked, it would spell disaster, as a general air of paranoia spread through the capital. So, after a few weeks had passed, he proposed a motion to decide on a new leader. His favorite candidate was, of course, himself, being Le Wittenberg's second in command and possessing large support from local governors. While Nazari was part of the national militia and a war hero, the council felt his adherence to revolutionary ideals was dubious. Still, he had enough support from the provincial governors and moderates to overweigh the powerful but scattered radical faction, and was narrowly voted in as the next great Alcad. He would use this position to do as much as possible to sideline the radicals, and the radical elements of the council would do as much as possible to obstruct him in return. They proposed constant sweeping reforms to society, reforms which Nazari was only barely able to strike down with his slim majority in powers as Alcad. While he had enough influence to keep all proposed radical policies at bay, he didn't have enough influence to put forward any legislation of his own, which is all struck down by the council's radical elements. Army expansions, blocked. Vital infrastructure projects, blocked. Reforms to tax collection, blocked. In one particularly grievous instance, budget overruns meant that large portions of the army were not being paid. With the council refusing to increase the budget, it seemed as if a mutiny was near. Aviv Nazari barely got out of the situation by paying all of the soldiers out of pocket at great personal expense. This convinced him that something needed to be done. His powers as Alcide might have been limited compared to the old Abraham of Wittenberg, but he knew he was still a very popular figure. He used his leverage as a war hero and leader of the military to influence various groups. The lack of pay might have angered the army, but he made it very clear whose fault it was and who it was who fixed the situation. Nizari began publicly denouncing the Grand Council, claiming that it was an oligarchic force holding the nation back. These denunciations made Nizari popular amongst the general populace, but greatly angered those still holding to the revolutionary principles. This came to a head with a clique in the Western Army called the New Aleppo Front. They sought to replicate Abraham of Wittenberg's fight against the Ottomans and overthrew Aviv Nizari to put a new Alcide in charge. They were growing popular amongst young officers and revolutionaries, potentially posing a major risk if kept unchecked. Heinz Ezekiel eventually found out about this clique and was conflicted. He, for the most part, agreed with their ideals, and also agreed with their complaints against Nizari. However, he was an army man first and foremost, and regardless of his opinions, would not tolerate sedition. He had the leaders arrested and reported everything to the government. Aviv Nizari used this as the perfect pretense to eliminate the power of the council, claiming they were responsible for organizing the clique. There was massive outrage amongst the public upon hearing about the conspiracy, and Nizari used this to finally dislodge the radicals from any position of power. He reformed the Grand Council to be composed entirely of provincial governors and others loyal to him, and finally secured complete control. As for Heinz Ezekiel, the man who discovered the plot, Nizari publicly congratulated him for, quote, bravely and loyally uncovering the treasonous plot which started due to Heinz's command structure. This extremely backhanded comment came in addition to a promotion. Heinz was removed from his position as General of the West and made General Overseer of the armies. This position, while higher on paper, held no command and essentially no authority, requiring the Alcide's permission for anything meaningful. Nizari was content in sidelining his personal rival and potential threat, but Heinz was livid. To Heinz, he stopped the plot against Nizari, and his reward was being publicly humiliated and then demoted for solely political purposes. To Heinz, he remained dutiful and refrained from injecting his politics into the military, and his reward was being sidelined due to military politics. Heinz may have helped Nizari once, but he would not forget this insult. But with all of this, the dust had settled, and Aviv Nizari was the great Alcide of Ikria. He paid lip service to the revolutionary principles, but he saw them as unnecessarily risky towards stability. He believed that the country's vast amount of untapped resources, rampant illiteracy, and general poverty was a much more important thing to address than high-minded ideals. He still did what he believed was best for the Ikria nation, but he believed that what was needed wasn't more nationalist posturing, but rather gradual development to catch Ikria up with the Western powers. One of the first things he did was renovate the old court of the Grand Vizier into a true capital district, with a government building and central capital that could be used more efficiently to manage the nation's bureaucracy. Then he turned south. He expanded the ports in Kuwait and ensured that taxes were being collected properly and efficiently. Then he moved north, expanding the farmlands across the Tigris and Euphrates until the centuries of Ottoman mismanagement would be washed away with a flood of grain and bread. He expanded the ancient reservoirs and aqueducts beneath Baghdad until they were not only practical, but a beautiful testament to the new regime. He sat as the light reflected the open glass of the new capital, and constructed Ikria based on the vision he always had and was always impeded. He wanted to make Baghdad the Paris of the East, and was going to ensure that Ikria could stand toe-to-toe with any Western power which tried to trample on it. Not through sheer force, not through ideological force of will, but through bread and gold. He also went to great lengths to branch out diplomatically with the West. He formed a particularly close relationship with the Prussians, visiting their king on many occasions and profiting massively. In addition to this, in the early 1790s, Nizari would acquire the colony of Guinea and a few years later purchase the colony of Hizamul from the Romans. This would give Ikria large amounts of sugar and cocoa, but perhaps even more importantly, increase their legitimacy on the world stage. One of Ikria's largest exports would soon become liquor. The Alcide had invested heavily into large alcohol facilities in Mosul, and the high-quality exotic liquor the Alcide produced would become sought after across all Europe. In fact, even 40 years later, alcohol produced in this time period remains a highly sought-after commodity and luxury good by the courts of Europe. As for the military, though he despised Heinz, he recognized the brilliance of his reforms, and left the structure of the Western Army mostly intact. He kept the professional corps an independent command structure, albeit under the command of a rotating cast of commanders loyal to Nizari. He kept the Eastern Army mostly as is, the larger pseudo-political force that would be the regular portion of the regime, while also prizing the Western Army as a small but elite group that could be used when necessary and left alone when not. Gradually, the differences between the Western and Eastern armies began to reflect the divide in Ikaria itself. The already rich western region, which served as the heartland of the revolution, received very little investment compared to the central corridor of Nizari was bent on bringing greatness to. It wasn't out of malice or sheer neglect, rather that Nizari suffered firsthand at the exploitation of his homeland in Kuwait, and therefore was less knowledgeable and had less of a will to do anything in what was a very culturally and economically different region. The West was, for the most part, fine with being left fairly autonomous, but as a result, began to grow apart from the rest of the nation. But regardless, Ikaria moved along slowly and steadily towards progress. Like the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the floods were over and the gentle flow of the water brought prosperity to the land. But once again, like those two rivers which have ruled this land for millennia, the whims of fate can change in an instant, and in the late 1790s, a growing clique in the west would risk flooding the banks of the rivers once more. But until then, Aviv Nizari sits in his home, staring through the crystalline glass in serene appreciation of the nation he has crafted. How long it will last remains to be seen.